welcome to this exploration of human identity needs. For me, this has been an important part of my both personal and intellectual journey because I got into the whole field of conflict studies because I wanted to understand how and why people commit atrocities, the worst that happens among people. I wanted to know the motivations of people, and in the study, which I thought would be about those people out there who do these terrible things, I learned that I myself have a lot of things in common with other human beings who can do terrible things. I'm motivated by similar things that they are motivated by. And the lens through which I got this self-discovery and this discovery of other people was through human identity needs. Now, I came to the concept of human identity needs through the work of John W. Burton, who is one of the pioneers in conflict studies and who had a similar longing to understand these sorts of things and who coined the term deep-rooted conflict. His whole notion of what deep-rooted conflict is and what drives conflict was turned upside down in the 1970s when he came across a needs theorist called Paul Seitz, whom you're going to hear about later. And when he heard about human identity needs, all of a sudden something lit up for him. He said, oh, now I understand much more deeply what this is all about. And he came up with this notion that when the non-material, non-negotiable identity needs of people are threatened, people will fight. So that's sort of the starting point for us right now. And you will see as we go through this that this concept of human identity needs is really useful for understanding a whole lot of things, from understanding young children to understanding leadership to understanding how we create better relationships within our families, within our communities, and so on. So here are some key questions. Why do people in conflict exhibit extreme passion and emotion? And you see that all the time when you watch the news. Somebody's a victim, or somebody who's charged up, or somebody who's engaged in conflict exhibits this, the strong emotions. And even when in the nightly news, when they say, if it bleeds, it leads, it's about, if there's something really passionate about it, then it's significant. It's important to people. We are tuned in to conflict. We're tuned in to things that touch us deeply. But alongside of this, there is this other phenomenon, is that sometimes people seem to do things that put at risk their own interests for the sake of something else. So people will fight for their culture, for their language, for their people, even though at a personal level it might not seem like this is in their own interest. There's something bigger, I guess, that is driving them to do that. And so when we say people, there's always this mirror aspect to it, because the people out there are like the people here. I am like the people out there. So the journey of discovery is not about others so much as it's about ourselves first. And through that understanding, through the laboratory of examining our own lives, we can understand others better. So when we think about it, and here in the background of what I'm saying right now, we have the work of Bernard Lonergan, but we have experiences. We get involved in things, and through this involvement, through these experiences, we build memories. And so now we're getting into the work of Paul Ricoeur, who says our memories are woven together into stories. One thing leads to another. And one way in which we identify ourselves is through the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about our people. And all of these stories together help develop a worldview. And this worldview is filled with values, generalizations, categories. When we think about identity groups, we think about the stories, but we also think about how there's a whole worldview in which people define themselves in terms of the other. What's different about the others? And we have even Freud's sense of the narcissism of small differences, where the tiniest differences are magnified to try to create the sense of difference, which comes through in the stories and then in the worldview and the generalizations. So we can picture it this way, that our memories, our stories, and worldview contribute to our identity need satisfiers, or how we construct our identity It comes with all of this baggage from the past that feeds into this. When I was starting this journey and people talked about identity needs, I kept asking, well, what really are the identity needs? Where do they come from? What are we really talking about? And in the literature, I identified 24, and I thought, oh, if we really want to be coming up with something that is meaningful and helpful to people to work with, 24 is a little complicated. So I synthesized these into the 5 needs that are on the screen: a need for connectedness, security, recognition, action or agency, and meaning. And it was pointed out to me by Janet McGrath, who grew up on the land with the Inuit people, that in southern Canada, in our mainstream society, we put a lot of emphasis on recognition. We need diplomas, degrees, driver's license. We need a lot of things that recognize us for something or another. In Indigenous communities, people start with connectedness, and everything flows from connectedness. And as she said that, it started to make sense to me that everything basically flows from connectedness. So that's where we're going to start. So we all have this need to have bonds, to have a place in community, to build relationships, to have mutually caring relationships, to feel this sense of real belonging. Now, there's a thinker in the field of conflict studies named Jesse Sutherland, who has a brand new TED talk in which it's all oriented to belonging. And she points out that there are groups and societies, you think about Indigenous people, where there was a massive break in connectedness through the children being forcibly taken to residential schools. But there are migrant groups today who have had to leave their countries, and there are tens of millions of people who have been forcibly removed from their place in their community where they were connected. And this is causing tremendous misery to all these people. So Mary Clark, one of the needs thinkers that I really connected with, if you like, put it this way, and here's a quote from her. It is not simply language per se that matters. It is shared goals, values, customs, traditions. It is the shared worldview, the shared jokes, taboos, social niceties, sacred objects, and ideas. It is the sense of a people reciprocally sharing a common fate that extends across not just a lifetime, but across generations. You know, I remember a rabbi coming into my class once, and he described to my students what it was like being Jewish, and he said, you know, he says, when I perform a circumcision, it feels like I've got a whole band of ancestors going right back to Abraham, looking over my shoulders, I'm doing this. So that sense of connectedness is a connectedness with our ancestors as well. Then when we think about security, what comes to mind for most people is a sense of security around food, shelter, and clothing, having the basics, I guess, that you need just to survive. But there's also physical security. We want to be sure that we're not going to be attacked, that somebody will not do something violent against us. But there's also economic security that really plays into our total sense of feeling secure, and then there's psychological and emotional security. So if we want to have a sense of confidence to do things, we need to feel a certain security within ourselves, and for a good quality of life, of course, we need to feel that on a day-to-day basis, all of these security needs are going to have proper satisfiers. We can also see that sometimes people are in a position of having contradictory needs around security. So if you think about a woman who's being beaten by her husband, and she's a stay-at-home kind of mother, back in an era when this was even more commonplace, a woman in this situation is caught between a threat to her physical security, a threat to being beaten, for instance, and a threat to her economic security if she leaves. And so you can think of lots of situations where in order to achieve one kind of security, people might put into question another type of security. Then when we think about recognition, we all need to be recognized as people who are significant in some way or another. So Francis Fukuyama, one thinker who writes about this, comes up with this ancient Greek concept of thumos, which has to do with a basic sense of being valued, of dignified, of being worth something. There's another philosopher named Alan Gewerth who talks about positive rights and a right to well-being and freedom. And so with recognition, if there's a recognition that we have a right to well-being and freedom, that's huge. And there are a lot of people who suffer because they're not recognized as being worth having well-being and freedom. So the recognition is for who we are, where we belong, what we do, and sometimes it's linked to justice, because sometimes somebody gets more recognition than we think we put more effort into a project than the next person, and they get more recognition. So we like to have recognition that's commensurate with what we think we've done and who we think we are. And then there's the matter of political recognition, and those people who live in situations where they or their people are not properly recognized, even at the individual level. They feel that something is lacking. I remember in one of my workshops I had two negotiators from the Palestinian Authority, and when I asked people about what was most important to them, right away they said recognition. So action is one of those precious things about who we are as people. Like, we can sit back at in a given situation and we can think about something and we can say, you know, if we did this, this, and this, it might make a difference. It might make it better. And so we have this capacity to imagine something and then take action. And some of these actions, if you like, are complex actions that go on for a long time. So you think about somebody who has a vision for producing a film, for instance. You know, they might start out as a screenwriter with an imagination of how this film could be, and that leads to then getting all the things in place to actually produce the film, and at the end you have a film. But that film started with the imagination of somebody who thought this could work. Now, Paul Ricoeur's philosopher in his book Oneself and Another talks about, for every action there's an actor and somebody he calls the sufferer, the person who's acted upon. And so if you think about it, you know, even my talking to you, and I'm in a sense acting upon you in that I'm taking the action and you're the recipient of that action. In other types of action, it becomes even more pronounced that one person is the agent who's imagining and doing what needs to be done, and other people are simply being acted upon. And so colonialism in its extreme form of being acted upon, where the people who were colonized were acted upon in such a way that they had fewer and fewer choices about where they ended up, what they were supposed to do, even what language they were supposed to be speaking. And so if you're acted upon enough, your sense of and capacity for agency, for authoring your own action, starts to be diminished, and it closes in on you. If somebody does everything for you, for children whose parents do absolutely everything for them, they grow up, and when they leave home, they don't know how to cook, they don't know how to do a whole lot of things to look after themselves. And so Paul Seitz, whom I referred to before, talks about our need to control our social and physical environment. And if you think about somebody in prison, for instance, there's a whole lot that they can't control. They don't have the freedom to move. And so freedom becomes an important part of this. And Viktor Frankl, though, who was in Auschwitz and was a psychiatrist who had a capacity to really think about what was going on, said, you know, there's one thing that the Nazis can't control around me. They control a whole lot of things, but there's one thing in the concentration camp they can't control, and that is what I think about. And so he started to frame his own capacity to think as a way of taking action that couldn't be controlled. We could also think about action as something that is both an individual and a community thing. So some communities have a capacity to do things, to take action, to make things happen in certain kinds of ways. Then we all have this need for meaning, a need to make sense of what's going on. And Oscar Nudler offers this concept of a world of meaning with a capital W, a sense of meaning that helps us make sense of all the other worlds of meaning. So we live in a world of sports, a world of science, a world of education, a world of local community, whatever. But among all of those things, we each have a set of primary values and a worldview that is the lens through which we make sense of everything. This includes a sense of justice. So we have a sense in our world of meaning that if we behave this and this way to somebody else, we can anticipate that they will reciprocate and treat us, say, with dignity, if we have treated them with dignity. And when it doesn't happen, then we have this sense of this world of meaning and world of justice has somehow been violated. And behind every conflict, for instance, if you scratch just a little bit, you see that people have a perceived injustice. They're doing what they're doing. The people who are violent generally have a sense that they're doing what they're doing because of a sense of injustice. Somebody has wronged them in some way, and that has intruded into their world of meaning. There are values associated with this world of meaning as well. Getting back to Lonergan, who says we have this longing to experience, to understand, to know, and to take appropriate action within the context of reality. So this drive to know and to understand and have a basis to make good judgments all feeds into this world of meaning that enables all of this to happen. Now, if there is a threat to any of these identity needs, there's an emotion associated with it. And I got this idea from Paul Seitz, who wrote a whole book chapter on analogs of emotion and needs. So when our sense of connectedness gets threatened, if we lose a relationship, or if somebody dies, or somebody moves away and we'll never see them again, or there's just been a huge conflict and a relationship is broken off, we have a sense of sadness. But if there's a persistent or pervasive sense of disconnect, there's a sense of alienation, a sense of being separate from everybody else, and a sense of aloneness, a sense of profound aloneness that goes along with that lack of connectedness. When our security need satisfiers are threatened, there's a strong emotion of fear, which is a primal emotion and drives a lot of things for people and is the source of tremendous misery. There's nothing like being afraid to the core of one's being and not having any sense of how one is going to get through this. I'm thinking to the beginning of the Okinawa crisis, July 11th, 1990. And the police had come to take down some wee little barricades across a wee little country road. And they came with tear gas and guns. There were hundreds of them, and there were women at the barricades. And so the tear gas was coming, and they felt afraid, and they felt attacked. And somebody said, "Oh, we should call the police," and then it sunk in on them. Oh, it is the police who are here. And so that sense of fear when you can't call the police, or you can't call anybody who can immediately give you safety and security, leaves one with this sense of, what on earth am I going to do when I feel this afraid and there's a threat to my security and I don't know how to get out of it. Then if there's a threat to our recognition, or we get negative recognition, we have a sense of shame. Now, the difference between guilt and shame, guilt has to do with a negative feeling about something we've done. We feel badly we did that. Shame is about who we are. And so if we get this negative recognition, we have this sense of, oh, I'm not nearly as good as the next person, or there's something basically the matter with me, or I will never change, or I will never have a basis to be thought of as being a contributing member of society. There's something basic. I'm bad. I'm basically not important, and I'm not good. And that's a terrible kind of feeling to live with. among indigenous people, there was a collective shame, and I've heard stories of mothers who would tell their children, don't let people know you're indigenous, because it won't go well with you if people think of you as being indigenous. So there's that sense of of shame associated with who one really is, which is really hard to come to terms with. If you can't take action, you get depressed. You don't know what to do, and you don't feel like doing anything. To really take action, you need a certain amount of self-esteem, and if you don't have self-esteem and you just feel shitty about yourself, it's very hard to do anything. It's hard to get out of bed in the morning, and so on. It's debilitating. And then when your meaning system is threatened, if somebody says something that really questions your worldview or goes against what you really believe in, or commits an injustice, then you feel anger. And these can all be connected and in various complex ways. However, if you're in a context of blessing, and I think of blessing as mutually as contributing to well-being, contributing to joy and happiness and so on, if you're in that kind of situation, you, in terms of connectedness, you experience love, empathy, you can feel one for another, you can understand what other people are feeling, and you develop a sense of trust. In terms of security, you have hope that you're going to be okay. You have a rush, you have a sense of excitement when you deliberately push the boundaries of security, like when people do risky things in sports, they experience a sense of excitement that is sort of in a controlled way putting your security at risk. And also there's a sense of peace when security has been established and you don't have to fear for somebody harming you, and this then contributes to good relationships. When it comes to recognition, you feel a healthy pride when you've done something well and you're recognized for it. A sense of ambition, and here I say a healthy ambition, that you feel like you could do something that would be worthy of being recognized. You feel like trying something. And for some people, you have a sense of entitlement. You have a sense of, I deserve something to come my way. And all of these, of course, have a negative side, because if somebody feels too entitled, they sort of step on the toes of other people. But there's also a sense of, I deserve this. In some high-achieving people, there is a kind of self-recognition. People realize within themselves that they're doing something significant. When it comes to action, there's the sense of anticipation. Something good is going to happen through what I'm doing. I can see I'm going to be able to do this. There's a great sense of joy when you're able to do something and it's working out the way you had planned it, or you've been able to overcome certain obstacles. And as you keep doing something and you become competent, there's a really good feeling of competence when you know, I've got it down, I'm able to do this. And then with regard to meaning, it's really good when somebody else validates your meaning system, when they say something that reinforces what you think to be true. But there's also in meaning this idea of curiosity, of interrogation, of asking questions, of always wanting to understand more and know better, and then also integrating ideas. When you find this idea relates to this idea in this kind of way, it can be really, truly exciting. So when we put these feelings associated with blessing, which I have on the right side of the screen, we can look at the opposite, which feelings that take place in a context, or what I call a mimetic structure of violence. So where you have validation in a blessing environment, you have denial in a violent situation. Where you have curiosity and openness, you have rigidity in a violent situation. And where you have integration, you have fragmentation. Or in terms of action, if it doesn't work out or if you can't do something, you can become dispirited, or you do something wrong, you have regret. If you feel like you're not sure if you can do something, instead of feeling competent, you're insecure. In terms of connection, Instead of love, there's hate. Instead of empathy, there's suspicion. And instead of trust, there's this narcissistic preoccupation with yourself rather than being open to other people. In terms of security, you can feel despair, shock, or dread in a violent situation, counteracting the hope or excitement and peace on the other side. And then when it comes to recognition, you can be motivated by envy, thinking the other person has more recognition and you want that for yourself, or you can be outraged by somebody else doing something that you thought you should be able to do, and there can be ongoing resentment over somebody else's getting something that you thought you should have. So you might want to pause this for a few moments. I'll go on with the presentation, but if you push the pause button, you can think for a moment about which identity needs are most important to you and which are most important to your community. If we were assembled and I was together with you, I'd ask you to vote on which of those identity needs were most important to you, but we can't do that. You might send me an email at some point talking about where you came out on those identity needs. I haven't said much about the self so far, so let's think about the self. And we can make a distinction between the primal self, the self involved directly in something, and the distal self, which is the self getting on the balcony and looking at the self. So the primal self could get angry and can express anger, and when you're angry, you feel the blood rushing to your head, you feel yourself getting upset, and you might use language that normally you wouldn't use, but you're in it, you're just feeling the anger. The distal self is the self becoming conscious and saying, oh, I'm starting to feel signs of I'm getting angry. I can tell that I'm getting angry right now, which is a very different kind of approach, if you like, than just plunging in and letting your anger run wild. And so when they say, if you start feeling angry, count to 10, the counting to 10 allows your distal self to cut in and you take a step back and say, do I really want to say all those angry things that I was about to say? So we can get on the balcony and look at ourselves and think about who are we? And who are we in relation to the different need categories? What are the satisfiers? Where do they come from? And so on. We can think about a self as a socially constructed kind of thing because we construct an image of ourselves within our social environment. We pick up certain things from other people and within our group, and we sort of find our place within whatever group we belong to. But then there's the self in relation to others. So a lot of times we don't think of ourselves purely as in isolation. We're always thinking of ourselves in terms of the others that we interact with. Now, some of these are self-other relations that are friendly, and we think of ourselves as, oh, I'm friends with the next person, or that person is really good at this, but I'm really good at this. And we do these kinds of comparisons to others. Sometimes it's an antagonistic kind of relationship to the other where we say, oh, the other's like this, they're real monsters. It's interesting, the imam and the pastor imam from Nigeria, they're a group that used to be antagonistic and are now working together, led a process between two tribal groups in Kenya after some of the violence. And it was interesting. They asked each group separately, who are you and what are you like and what is the other group like? And it was very interesting to see the kind of stereotypes they developed of the others, and they worked with this then to share with that, and as one group shared what they perceived the other to be like, the other had a chance to sort of clarify and respond to that. But it's always interesting to see how other people see you and how you position yourself in relation to others. But there's also the transcendent self. There's the infinite within each of us that is really significant, and there's a capacity to connect to the infinite in the other and to connect with that which transcends, to connect with the Creator, if you like, at a profound level. So our self, if you like, has many, many different dimensions to it. Now, there are some dynamics between these identity need categories. So let's think about connectedness and security together, and if we think of the example of betrayal, somebody betrays us. Well, that certainly has an impact on our sense of connectedness. We start to feel a sense of distance, and it's hard for us to trust. But it also plays havoc with our sense of security, because if we really trusted somebody, we felt secure in that relationship, we might divulge something to somebody with whom we feel connected, that because we trust them, we can give them that information, and all of a sudden what we said could be used against us, so it's a threat to our security. So these two work together in a negative way when something like betrayal happens. But on the positive side, as we establish greater connectedness, we feel more and more secure. And as we feel more and more secure, we feel we have a greater capacity to trust and to build relationships with other people. If we put recognition and action together, and we think about favoritism. So one group is favored over another, or in a family, one sibling seems to be favored over the other. The one who's favored has all this capacity for action. They get resources, they get support, and so on. And the person who is not in the favored group feels a sense of resentment. They might even feel a sense of shame, and that they're not recognized, and they feel like they can't do as much within their particular context. So we think about where might there be favoritism. Well, sometimes it happens politically, where one political party gets elected and they do everything just for people in their own party, for instance. Or if you think, going back to Kenya, there's a proverb that when a president is elected from one particular group, that particular group says, now it's our turn to suck, because there's the sense that the president is going to favor that particular tribe, and the others feel a sense of disempowerment because they aren't going to get as many resources. Now we could do the same thing, putting all the different need categories together and thinking through how do they work together. Now, the positive side of this is that the greater the recognition, the greater the capacity for action, and the greater capacity for action, the more you get recognized. And I think in my day-to-day life, there's a lot of recognition that doesn't cost anything. And if we weave into our lifestyle a recognition of other people, and an encouragement that goes with the recognition, we can contribute to the well-being of others without it costing anything. Now, we as human beings not only think about the past and put together a meaning system and worldview based on the past, but we're always oriented toward the future as well, and this comes from Paul Ricoeur as well. So we're always living with an imagination of what could happen in the future and what we might be capable of, and what we want ourselves as individuals, or even our groups, our identity groups, to become or to achieve. As we look to the future, we're never satisfied. It's never good to say, oh, isn't it nice to just be together and be at peace? After a while, just sitting together and being at peace might seem a little boring. We want to do things. We want to move ahead to the future. We have a vision for stimulation, for growth, for challenge, out of this being at peace, which is a wonderful thing to acknowledge at certain key points. But we also want to build on that. We want to be creative. We want to address new challenges and so on, and we want to do it in a mutually beneficial kind of way. We're also concerned about our continuity as individuals and groups, and that's part of the reason, we want to be remembered. We want our children to do well, our grandchildren, and in Indigenous context, we learn to think ahead 7 generations, and so we're not thinking only about ourselves right now, but what will our descendants experience 7 generations from now, and how can we do something right now that will enable that better future? So there are different kinds of need satisfiers that come into play. Some are material. Sometimes we say, oh, if only I got that particular thing. Now, material things are zero-sum. If one person has something, especially if it's unique and can't just be replaced, the other person can't have it. Only one person can have a material thing at the same time. So we call that zero sum. If one person has it, the other doesn't, and if the other person gets it, the first person doesn't have it. Land sometimes is an important identity need satisfier because we can feel connected to the land. We can feel that land is the basis of our taking action. Land has symbolic value and economic value. Land is the place where our stories, our identity stories, take place. So when Gloria, my lifelong partner, and I spent almost a month in Israel because we've studied Hebrew and Greek and have a knowledge of ancient Near Eastern history, and we've studied the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It was really special to see how meaning came out of land, and we could do geographical theology, sort of coming up with new insights because of being on the land where these identity stories took place. We're always comparing our need satisfiers with others. So siblings often want what the other has, and this sort of leads to what I'm going to talk about in a moment, mimetic desire. We imitate the desires of others. We want what others have, and so our need satisfiers are sometimes based on that. And young children with toys, you're going to have a whole pail of toys, and I've watched my grandchildren when they were young, and one would pick a certain toy and the other would want that toy right away, even though there were many other toys to choose from. Money is interesting because for some, money is just instrumental. I need money in order for security or to buy things that might be interesting. It's good to have, it's nice, but for other people, money is key to their identity. They want to have money for its own sake. They want to be rich. They want to be richer than anybody else. And even though you could ask the question, why does a billionaire want more money? I mean, they've got enough to buy whatever they really need, but yet they're always out there for more. Why is that? And it has something to do with their identity and what they need to feel complete in themselves. Then there are spiritual ways of meeting these needs. Things that have to do with what is transcendent can address our need for meaning, can fill in our connectedness at another level, can give us a certain security so that we feel a sense of hope even though there are a lot of threatening things around us and so on. And caring, the well-being of others can lead to need satisfaction as well. So when we think about this mimetic phenomenon of imitation, mimetic is imitation, imitating the desires of other people, or at a profound level imitating some aspects of them. And René Girard, who came up with these concepts in the 50s and 60s, was corroborated in more recently when neuroscientists have said we have these mirror neurons in our brains that give us this capacity for imitation. It's sort of built into who we are. So need satisfiers are developed in a community and in a culture and within relational systems. So within certain cultures, certain things are really important for a young woman or for a young man to achieve. And so these are important for recognition, for action, to go through rites of passage or to excel at certain things, to get to do certain things, and these then become important to their identity. Sometimes there's a competition for need satisfiers, and there's this mimetic rivalry. I want what you want, and you want what I want, and so these things become really significant motivators for us and a way of defining our need satisfiers. So that means an ordinary satisfier becomes even more significant if somebody else has mimetic desire for that same thing. So these are all relative. And on the positive side, there's this concept of exemplars. So somebody can be an exemplar, and you might say, I want to live a life like that person. And so for myself, having just retired, I look at René Girard as sort of an exemplar for me, and well into his 80s, he was still coming up with new ideas and publishing new things. And so I think, I've got a number of years left when I can be doing productive things if I want to be somewhat like René Girard, who I look up to. Now, when it comes to when violence starts to enter the situation and we have threats to identity needs operating at all these different levels in a violent system, or if people are really severely threatened, we can have what I call a mimetic structure of entrenchment. A mimetic structure is mimetic, it's imitative, and the structure is a pattern that goes on through time. So entrenchment means you get really entrenched into your thought system and so on. So when it comes to connectedness, people in this sense of entrenchment say, you're either my enemy or my friend. And so there's no gray matter, and I'm going to do things only for my friends, and I'm going to do things against anybody who's my enemy. And if anybody's my friend, then they're going to help me do anything that I call on them to do against my enemies. And so action is directed toward these very focused goals, and our meaning system then becomes fundamentalist in that it's I believe in this so strongly, and you have to believe exactly as I believe. There's a right and a wrong, and you have to believe the right way. There are also mimetic structures of transcendence, which are just the opposite. These are inclusive. They integrate other people. And I've put this relationship like a Tai Chi. There's a sense of we belong together, and in the words of Desmond Tutu in his philosophy of Ubuntu, I am not complete unless you are complete. My completeness comes with your sense of well-being. I'm diminished if you are diminished, and I will feel much better about myself if you feel better about yourself, and so on. We can think about trauma as coming about when there's a severe attack on one's security, where our self is overcome with fear. And all we think about is security, and at a certain point we become narcissistically wounded. We can't think about anybody else. We're alienated. And we have questions, and all of our other identity need satisfiers are sort of fuzzy as we concentrate on our security. Now, we could also think about identity needs in an integral way. So Ken Wilber has said, for any phenomenon, there's an interior side represented on the left and an exterior part that we can observe on the right. And above the line, it's individual and collective. So we could say identity needs and their satisfiers have an interior dimension, an exterior dimension, they're individual and they're collective. So on the interior, we have memories, we have feelings, we have an imagination, thoughts, and intentions related to anything that we do. And on the exterior, there are the actions, the communication, the justification for what we did, the connections that are made. In the collective interior, we have teachings, we have a culture, we have ceremonies, we have a narrative that guides our community, and we have shared values. And then these then are manifest on the right side, lower right, through our institutions, through collective action, through the systems we put into place, through alliances that we might have with other groups, and for the kind of recognition, even political recognition, of groups that we're in relation with. Now, when I presented these needs several decades ago, there was a child psychologist who said, oh, these identity needs really help us understand young children. And as I've watched my grandchildren, especially with these need categories in mind, I start to see that they're operative from the very beginning. The really young babies need connectedness, they need bonding, they need trust, they need to be held, they need hugs. They have a need for security. First and foremost, they need food, they need protection, they need to feel like they are safe and they are sheltered. And this is reinforced with a strong kind of connectedness. They need recognition. Sometimes they cry out, we are here, notice us. we're worth something. They need a kind of responsiveness from elders, and around 9 months they have a sense of shared attention. They want you to recognize, hey, we're looking at the same thing. They want to know that they are recognized as paying attention to the same thing as adults might be. And the need for action for very young children is really significant. And once children get to be 2, 3 years old, maybe sometimes even younger, they have this need to, if they can direct adults, if they can tell adults what to do, and in a playful kind of situation, you go along with it, they are just so pleased because they're in charge, and you start to see this beginning of this capacity to imagine and do things, and it's wonderful for their development if they start to be able to do things on their own. And especially if they get recognized for it. And very early on, they have a need for meaning and a capacity for communication. I still remember one of my grandchildren banging his head on the floor when he was 1 year old. He hadn't learned to talk yet, and you could tell he had ideas, and he was so frustrated that he couldn't communicate those ideas. He had figured things out, but he couldn't express them, and he was just so frustrated. So all of these figure in really early on in life, and so for parenting and for even communities thinking about their children, you can think about how you can develop their capacity to grow in these need areas. So when it comes to leadership, as I told you at the very beginning, these need categories I thought of, first of all, to understand people in conflict, but they're also really important to think about how one can take initiative within a group. And when I think about leaders, it's not only formal leaders, but all of us can be leaders in terms of helping to shape our families, our institutions, taking initiative within any context. So if we think about the interior aspect, the upper left, a leader can have an imagination of community well-being in all 5 of these areas. They can think about what would be really good for my community in terms of taking new action, and if there's a need for economic development, what would be a new thing that could be done. I remember being in a dialogue in northern Quebec, and this one person said, you know, there was this old blueberry farm that used to be around, and we could use that to teach young people entrepreneurial skills in the summer. They could run the blueberry farm and they'd learn about running a business, and it was really neat to see the light go on and an imagination for something new that could be done. And then one takes personal action, communicates that, and other people get on board. It has an impact, and then we go down to the lower left to a community. A community starts to think about these ideas, starts to observe the action, starts to get a sense of, oh, we could do this sort of thing. And then that moves over to the lower right, where collectively a group starts to do some new things. So there's a growth of public spirit, the economy might grow, or there could be a new sense of community well-being that results from all of that. So here I've shared with you something that's been important for me in figuring out different aspects of my life when I've had a significant loss from a job, for instance, and I'm really feeling in the dumps. I say, oh, why am I feeling so badly? And I go through the need categories and I say, oh, I used to get need satisfiers from that particular job. And it's perhaps not the smartest to tie one's identity to a particular position, because if you ever lose that position, whoa, it really affects you deeply. On the other hand, when I think about projecting into the future, concentrating on these different things and being deliberate about my own self-development or what's going on in my family, it's a really useful thing, and in many situations it leads to asking the question, what's going on here in relation to meaning? What's going on in terms of relationships and connectedness? What's going on in relation to security? What's going on in relation to recognition and capacity for action? And so for anything I do, I'm always very conscious of who's taking the action, and sometimes I realize it's not my role to do everything for everybody else, but if I can do something that contributes to other people being able to do something that takes control of their lives, we're all much better off for it. So thank you for sharing this time with me, and if you want to respond, my email is vredekop@rogers.com.